Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide divorce, mediation, and valuation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we'll discuss business value drivers with John Warilow. He is the founder of the Value Builder System, which is a practice management software for business advisors. And he has a best-selling book called Built to Sell, Creating a Business That Can Thrive Without You. It was recognized by both Fortune and Inc. magazine as one of the best business books and has been translated into 12 languages. He's also written a few more books that we'll talk to you later about. But prior to founding the Value Builder System, he started and exited 4 different companies, including one acquired by a public company. He lives with his family in Toronto, and you can follow him by signing up at builttosell.com. He also has a podcast, and we'll talk more about that as well. But welcome, John. How are you?
I'm great, Melissa. How are you?
Well, I'm doing well. And I think
mediation person must be just like a crazy way to make a living. You must hear the craziest stuff.
You know, you kind of have to keep the numbers in one area and the drama in another area. And if you can do that, if you can separate the drama from the financials, then you'll be fine. So it'll be fun.
Well, we're not talking about divorce today.
We're not. And I think business value drivers is a very interesting concept because people are like, okay, what do you mean? And I don't even always like the concept, but I think that there is a lot to be said about it. And one of the issues is that people just traditionally think that the things that drive business is customers and revenue. And that's it. And if I can get more customers and revenue, then I will be worth more. But you kind of take it a little bit further, and what really drives value in a business?
Yeah, so we've done now 60,000 different questionnaires with business owners and asked them about the value of their company. If they've received an offer in the last year, what offer of multiple was that for? And we've determined that there are these 8 drivers of value that go beyond revenue and customers that acquirers pay a lot of attention to, and in fact, drive the value of your company. So we have this thing called a Value Builder score, which gives you a measure on these 8 key factors. Those that get an average score on these 8 key factors are getting offers of about 3.5 times pre-tax profit. Those achieve a score of 90 or greater on these 8 key drivers are getting offers of 7.1 times pre-tax profit. So it's a huge impact on the value of your company, focusing on not just the revenue of your business, but also some of these other factors. I mean, one of the big ones is recurring revenue, right? So we think of revenue as revenue, but actually recurring revenue is much more valuable in the eyes of an acquirer. I just did some analysis on security companies, the guys who, install the sensors in your home or your office, and then they call the fire brigade, fire department if you have a fire, whatever. They have installation revenue and they have monitoring revenue. The installation revenue is the one-off revenue, and the monitoring revenue is the recurring. Today, a buyer will pay about 75 cents for every dollar of installation revenue, and the same buyer will pay about $3 for every dollar of recurring or monitoring revenue. And so not all revenue is created equally, and recurring revenue is so much more value. It's one of the reasons it's one of the 8 key drivers of value.
Well, and what you're talking about in these 8 drivers of value, because we, in some capacity, this is, the system that you've created is to allow advisors, like me, valuation people, accountants, financial people, to come in and help quantify how a business will actually change the value when they go to sell. And so I think that is a little different. So when you say scoring on these metrics, that's a little different than just going in and be like, you look profitable. I think that the multiple is probably 3 to 5 times EBITDA. And they're like, but is that for yeah, it's for everyone. So you're doing something that's trying to get a little bit more tangibility to these drivers. But the reality is, all of these drivers are just topics that if we drill down deeper, we would understand, like the business owner and the advisor would understand really what is happening. So can we take like one example of a value driver that you guys discuss in your software? And then let's drill it down to a couple things within that driver that can like business owners and advisors understand, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So let's take monopoly control. Monopoly control is what Warren Buffett refers to when he says he invests in companies with a deep and wide competitive moat. Meaning the more differentiated your product or service is, the more pricing authority you have, the more the ability to control your margins. More margins, you can invest more in sales and marketing. And so it creates this thick defense layer against people trying to compete with you if you do one thing better than anybody else. And what's interesting so that's just good business hygiene, but what's interesting from a kind of an acquirer's point of view is when they go to look at buying a business, they're making a build versus buy decision, right? So they're saying, have you built something that is so unique, so difficult to compete with, that the cheapest and fastest way for us to get into this market is to buy your company? If by contrast, you are, responding to RFPs, billing by the hour, in kind of competes, bake-offs for business, those businesses are not very valuable because an acquirer will rightly say, well, if we just lower the price by 5 points, we can pick up all that business you're winning based on pricing. Mm-hmm. And so where you have real premiums being paid in the marketplace is where there's something truly unique about what that company does. I'm reminded of a woman I interviewed on Built to Sell Radio named Stephanie Breedlove, built a great business. She does payroll for parents who have a nanny to pay. So a very, very kind of small niche within the overall payroll category, just parents who have a nanny to pay. And she built this company up and at about $300,000 in revenue. So very early in its tenure, she found it harder to find parents who had a nanny to pay. And she had sort of this fork in the road. She could effectively sell other things to her existing clients, which is what everybody was telling her to do, right? Like the kind of prevailing wisdom was like, it's 9 times easier to sell an existing customer a new product than it is to go find a new customer. And she was like, okay, well, what else do these people need? I'm selling them payroll right now. If they're busy parents with kids, maybe they need swimming lessons for their kids, or maybe they need snow removal for like all these things you could sell busy parents. Instead, she took the much, much more difficult road, which was to double down on her niche and say, no, I'm not in the business of swimming lessons. What we do is payroll for nannies. And so she took the much slower road to growth and just focused on payroll for nannies. 25 years later, she had built the business up to $9 million in revenue, just doing payroll for parents who had nannies to pay. Well, along comes care.com. Have you ever used care.com, Melissa? Do you know those guys? Yeah. So you plug in your zip code, it'll give you 5-star rated babysitters in your local market. Well, they had 7 million subscribers. If you think about it, these are all parents who have a nanny to pay, right? So Breedlove went to her and said, look, she was the CEO of Care. And she said, look, you've got 7 million subscribers. I've got this little $9 million business here. We've got 10,000 customers. What if you bought our business and you sold payroll services to those 7 million subscribers? If 1% of your 7 million subscribers, that's 70,000 customers, right? Anyways, long story short, she sold Breedlove and Associates, her little $9 million company, for $54 million. It's an example of where doing one thing better than anybody else, and absolutely obsessing over that for a 25-year period gives you a deep and wide competitive moat that becomes very difficult to compete with. So I think the prevailing wisdom is, and you said it earlier, Melissa, it's like revenue is the only thing that matters, right? It's like, we got to get bigger. And while I think revenue is an important part of valuation, I think it overstates its importance. What I think is much more important is monopoly control, doing one thing better than anybody else, and creating that deep and wide competitive moat.
Well, and I think that's essentially sometimes when you're moving beyond the numbers. So if you're moving beyond the numbers and you're doing something that competitively no one else can do, right? Because I mean, think about, we do valuations, right? And I mean, a computer could do it, a person could do it. You crunch the numbers, whoop-de-woo, right? We're not in the business for crunching numbers. We're in the business to settling disputes. That's it. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. It doesn't matter how many different numbers there are. We settle disputes. We settle disputes maybe quicker and easier and more efficient or productive than other people. Okay, fine. But you have to continue to do that. Like, what is the piece that you bring to the table, right? That is the differentiator that nobody can replace, if you will. And then how does that transfer to somebody else? Because sometimes when you build that so much reliant upon the main owner or the main management team, right? You still have an issue that it's all locked up in there. And oh, great. Now I'm coming as a buyer and I'm saying, well, you do everything amazing, better than anybody else, but it's all locked up in your head. Like that is, this is where we get into some of the issues that you're talking about, is how have you created a business that you can walk away from? How does it work without you involved? Yeah. And again, those lead into some of the value drivers, right?
Yeah. I mean, to your point about can you walk away, another value driver is what we refer to as hub and spoke. And it really defines how dependent your company is on you as the founder. And the ideal is obviously that your company can thrive without you. One of the questions we include in Value Builder is, if you were out for 3 months, how well or poorly would your business perform? And if your business can take you leaving for 3 months, it's a sellable, transferable asset. No question about it. It's something that someone would want to buy, because that's the key determinant of a business that's transferable is, does it run without the owner? And I think it's easier said than done. I did an interview on Built Already with a woman named Jody Cook, wonderful entrepreneur from the UK. And she built a social media advertising agency. So if you wanted to show up in Instagram or Facebook, and she would create ads for you and videos and so forth. In the early days, she even called it JC Cook. The name of her company had her surname in it. So it was completely intertwined with her personally. In the early days, it was just really selling her time and selling her kind of expertise. But quickly she realized that she wanted to build a company that could thrive without her, that it wasn't just her. And one of the first things she did, and one of the things we talk a lot about, is she really codified what they do into standard operating procedures. These are written documents usually, or videos that describe how things get done inside your company. And they become the sort of operating manual for your employees to work from when you're not there. And so this process of standard operating procedures was incredibly important for her to build a company that ultimately became more than just her. I think she had 14 employees when she decided to sell it. So she was able to scale it beyond her, which is a feat for a marketing services practice where it's oftentimes the owner's expertise. But the really, I think that the clincher in the why these SOPs are so important is that it makes your company not only more valuable, but more sellable. Because when she went to sell, she sold and got out without an earnout. And that is a really significant achievement in a marketing services business. An earnout, for folks who haven't heard that term before, is where you have effectively get paid a tranche of your proceeds for selling your company up front. And then there's another tranche or 2 or 3 in the future if you were to reach goals as a division of the acquiring company. And of course, earnouts are usually at risk, meaning they're not guaranteed. And in Jody's case, she was adamant that she did not want an earnout. And part of what she did to avoid it was to create these standard operating procedures. And when she got out, she sold, and she sold at the higher part of the range of what she was hoping to get for her business. I think she was hoping for 6 to 7 times EBITDA, and I think she sold at the higher end of that. And she sold and walked away 2 weeks later. And that would never have been possible had she not documented her standard operating procedures and improved her score on this value driver called hub and spoke.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that everybody, when we say, okay, the value driver is how do you operate the company with kind of being away, right? Going to an island for 3 months, right? With no cell service. But what people don't necessarily understand is the action items below that are really the pieces. So it is developing the infrastructure. It is allowing the control to move down the ranks. It is allowing people to have control to make decisions at certain levels. So it's not just about like, oh, can I leave? No, it's have you built all the layers that allow you to leave, and the layers are what people find beneficial and valuable
Absolutely.
because they can
Absolutely.
put somebody else in your position. They can put somebody else, or maybe they don't need that position. And so I think that it's not just about, creating a better cell phone that will go to the island with you so that you can answer all the questions, right? It's about building a better structure, and the people want the structure. But you said something interesting about the person's name was within the title of the business.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any? I have some feelings about that, but do you have any feelings about what you've seen as clients sell? Is that important or not?
Yeah, it can be important on a couple of different levels, and I'm sure you've seen it in your own work. It does beg the question, how easily can this business be separated from the founder, the owner, the namesake? So it discounts your valuation based on the fact that it's hard to separate, number one. The other piece that I think is important here is that psychologically for an entrepreneur, it can be hard to leave your company if your surname is in the name of the business. So we have a tool called Prescore where we measure the owner's personal readiness to exit, psychological readiness to exit their company. And we know that if the company name is their surname or has their surname inside, it's psychologically more difficult for them to leave. So not only does naming your company have with your own surname in it discount to some extent the valuation, it also makes it harder for you to leave, because it's hard if you're like John Doe and Sons Bakery and you sell and you see John Doe and Sons vans and trucks driving all around town, and they're driving too fast, or they're clipping corners, or the guy driving doesn't look great, or whatever. This is your namesake that you've sold, and it becomes very hard to do that. So here's what I would say. I mean, if you've named your company, there's a huge cost to changing the name of your company, and that may, depending on how much brand equity you've created in that name, it may be just too much to bear. So what I would suggest you do in that case is to really focus on branding your products. Like if we think about, like Johnson & Johnson owns a brand called Band-Aid. You might argue that Band-Aid is a much more prominent brand than Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson were actually two brothers, right? Like they are two people, but the brand has far eclipsed the equity in those two individuals' names over hundreds of years, to now that we appreciate the brands within the Johnson & Johnson family. So Band-Aid as an example. So if your name appears in your company name, I mean, one option is to change your company name. I don't think you have to go to that extent. I think you can start to elevate your products such that they take first billing in your branding and marketing, and your company name starts to become secondary. And I think you can somewhat bridge that gap. I don't know, Melissa, what have you seen? Like, what advice do you give people where their surname is in the company name?
Well, I think it's a hard position, like melissagragg.com. Does John want to buy melissagragg.com and run that operation? And every time they're like, oh, I went to melissagragg.com, but Melissa Gragg wasn't there, and so
she must not care about me.
Right. She doesn't care about me. She's moved on. And it creates, but if you look at institutional companies, that's what happens. They keep these partners on like indefinitely. Like everybody knows that they're not doing. Melissa Gragg is retired and living in Florida. Everybody knows that, but they keep him as the figureheads on the company because that's what they created and things like that. If you have, all of these things. So in my mind, branding on keywords, branding on words that would be kind of transmutable and somebody could take it on or incorporate it, I think, like incorporate the entire name into their organization, I think is more sellable, because if you create all of the pipeline, all of the pipeline around your business is melissagragg.com, right? It really, it not only from a theoretical standpoint prevents people from coming in, right? So I probably can't build as quickly because people are like, oh, where do you work? melissagragg.com. It's like, oh, how much do you interact with that company? Well, not much. It's really about Melissa Gragg. You know what I'm saying? So I think that people have a love for their name and a love for their legacy. And so they kind of have this habitual thing to put their name in the business. But I see that most of the time it is upsetting to business owners when that company literally comes in and doesn't keep the name, and just kind of takes the customers or does whatever, because they are coming in with a name that they have built. And so, sometimes you can have a merger of names and things like that. But I think right now we are in a time period where we're going to see a lot of people start to make their way on their own, and I think that there is some intention at the beginning of how you name this, how you wrap around the social media, how you get known. There's a lot of, in the marketing world, there's a lot of branding concepts around personal branding versus corporate branding. I think all of these things are important, but a buyer is not going to necessarily want that name. So you're going to spend all this time and effort to create something that is not going to be of value to the buyer. And I think that people should create businesses with the exit in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would draw the distinction between a company name and a brand. A company name is just the words on the paper, right? A brand is a preference. It is a relationship. It is it's customers gravitate towards a relationship with a brand. So, again, you want to make sure you have a brand. One way to do that is through branding your products. Another way to do it is branding your name, but you want to make sure it's separate from you as an individual, as a person, and who has a name. You want to make sure you have a brand rather than just a name.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to some large companies, right, that have 200, 300, 400 employees. And I've said, you send your 200, 300 employees all out there, touting ABC accounting firm, right? And I said, but what if you gave all 400 people the power to really go deep into their niche, right? And maybe they do something very specific, right? They just value dental practices. That's it. Sure. Over and over and over, every day, every day, every day. So why wouldn't you allow them to create kind of a personal expertise under their own brand, under their own, social network or whatever, and they just talk about what they know. They know it, they love it, they talk about it in the way that they probably get clients. Now you have 400 brand ambassadors that are talking about very niche specific topics and are everywhere, right? You can't go anywhere without seeing, well, ABC accounting firm does this and does that and does that and does that. But it then seems bigger, right? Then the whole of it seems even bigger than the parts. And I think that that's where things are going. You have a company that allows its employees, like that tells the culture. Your story, how you operate, how you control things tells your culture. What culture does that tell, right? So it's what story does your company tell? Because when you go to sell your company, you're telling a story, a historical story, a future story, a prophecy, right? What is that story and what is the makeup of it?
I'll give you an example of that from Built to Sell Radio, where I interviewed the founders of a company called Embanet, and it speaks to the importance of the narrative, the story you tell about your company, not only to your customers, but also to acquirers, and how much it can drive the value of your business. So Embanet in the early days was they thought of themselves as a graphic design / web development shop. And they started to carve out a niche of helping universities and colleges put their courses online. And it wasn't really intentional. They just started doing a lot of work with universities. University 1 referred them to University 2, and they just kind of built out a bit of a niche. And early in their tenure as a company, they got an offer, and the offer to buy their business was pretty standard in the marketing services space. It was around 3 times earnings. So not a spectacular exit. And both the founders said, you know what, we like to do better. We want to get a better valuation for our company. And so they kind of did some soul searching and thinking about how they were positioning what they did and really talking about their narrative to the marketplace. And what was going on at the time in the marketplace was that there was a boom in the e-learning space. This was around the time, I don't know if you remember this, a couple of years ago, where Lynda was acquired by LinkedIn. And then LinkedIn, in fact, was acquired by Microsoft. And a lot of what was driving those acquisitions was wanting to own this kind of e-learning space. And so these two founders of Embonet said, well, what if we just kind of changed and pivoted the narrative? Instead of talking ourselves as a web development shop, why don't we talk about ourselves being kind of leaders in this e-learning category, right? Being kind of pioneers in the e-learning space. Because really that's what we're doing. We're taking universities and helping them become more digital courses and so forth. Anyways, long story short, about 2 years after they turned down an offer for 3 times earnings, they accepted an offer of more than 13 times earnings. And a big part of that was how they were talking about their company. They improved the business and made some structural changes to the company. So there were other reasons they got 13 times earnings. But a big part of it, in my view, is also just the narrative they're telling the market. Instead of saying we're a generic design shop, no, we're leaders. We're in the burgeoning e-learning space. That's a very different narrative. And I think it just goes to your point about the story you tell about your business. It does have an impact when you go to sell.
No, and I think that even, one step further is it's the story you tell, it's finding a right fit. I think that everybody who goes to sell their business and even advisors that go and try to, get some of these exit planning business, right? The reality is what I've seen is that a lot of business owners who are successful never, ever, ever question when they're going to retire, right? Or when they're going to sell. It's like, now if they get sick or something happens, yes, well, that's not the right time to sell, right? But they just don't think about it because they're like, I'm going to do this until I die, which is great. But I think that the reality is that people need to understand how much more value can I create by working how much longer? And is that the benefit, is there a cost benefit there? Because at some point you want to enjoy life. There's still stresses of running a $50 million company. You have the debt load, you have all of this concern about the future. But the reality is the value is sometimes going to be placed just on the profitability. So if I have $1 million company that makes 200,000 at the bottom line or $1 at the bottom line, it's still $1 million company, right? But how much do I want to pay for the $1 or the 100,000? So if you create a scenario where they're just looking at the numbers, then you're never going to get the highest price. They have to buy into the story. They have to buy into the story of how they're going to integrate your company, right? And all of that kind of combines. So I think that the people who are operating in this space, there is a lot of intangible issues. Even as the world progresses, the whole world is different now. Like, what are you going to do? How is your business going to accommodate in the real world? And even with that, because we push this off into the middle, but I think that it's relevant. What are we seeing happening right now with business owners that may have been hit hard during the pandemic. A lot of people have been hyper successful. That may also not continue, right? The hard times or the wonderful times may not continue. So what do we do now post pandemic? Where do you see the future going in some of these companies in selling?
Yeah, well, we've actually done some research. So we looked at people who completed the Value Builder questionnaire prior to March of 2020. So prior to the pandemic being sort of globally announced. And then compared to the next 9 months. So the kind of calling it during the pandemic, as it were. I realize we're not out of it yet, but that was the sort of window we looked at. So pre and during. And we looked at all of the ways they answered the Value Builder questionnaire, and we analyzed them to see if the pandemic has caused any change in behavior. And there were a few that were really interesting. One is that the proportion of business owners who told us their exit intent was to pass their business to their kids has dropped off the floor, off a cliff. Okay. It has been replaced by people who expect to sell to a third party. Now, the number of people that used Value Builder that tell us their exit intent is to sell to a third party is over 50%, 50%. And the proportion that's planned to pass their business to their kids has dropped from double digits, 18, 19, to less than 10%. That's a profound change. And I think what's going on is this pandemic has been really catastrophic for a lot of businesses, in particular service businesses. And the idea of passing that albatross down to my kids has just become untenable. I don't want to pass that burden on. So I'd rather sell for the best I can do and get out. So that's number one. The second big trend we're seeing is that people have pulled forward their sell-by date, right? I mean, this has been a near-death experience for a lot of people, right? In some cases, literally, in other cases, just figuratively, it's been catastrophic and traumatic in many, many ways. And therefore, people have had a near-death experience and they've said, life's too short. You know, I don't want to just keep running this business forever. There are other things I want to do with my life. And so we've seen business owners bring forward their sell-by date by about 20%. In other words, we ask them on the Value Builder questionnaire, like, when do you plan on selling? 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And the proportion of said we're bringing it forward is grown by 20%. So we're seeing people want to sell sooner and sell to a third party. And it raises the issue of, and this gets back to your comment earlier about sort of timing, and that is when's the right time to sell? And I think the right time to at least ask yourself the question is when you crest something called the freedom point. And the freedom point is the point at which the sale of your company will generate enough liquid wealth to live comfortably for the rest of your life. And I think at that point, it's worth at least pulling up and saying, is now the right time, right? Because for most owners, some owners want to be the next Steve Jobs, the next, Elon Musk. But for most owners, I think their highest aspiration is for freedom, is independence. Like, that's why they got into business and didn't go to work for Procter & Gamble. Like, they want independence. And when you reach that, when you achieve that, and the sale of your business would allow you to be fully financially free, I think it's just worth pulling up, asking the question, is now the right time? I'm reminded of a guy I interviewed. Have you ever had a guy named Rand Fishkin on the show, Melissa?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, Rand, I would say, if you haven't had him on,
no, we haven't had him on. No.
He would be a great guest if you ever need a great guest. He wrote a wonderful book called Lost and Founder about his experience. I had a chance to interview him on Built to Sell Radio, and he described the growth and subsequent loss of his company, Moz. So Moz was in the SEO, search engine optimization space, built it up to 5 million in revenue when he got a call from HubSpot. Brian Halligan, co-founder of HubSpot, wanted to buy his business, and they offered him $25 million of cash and HubSpot stock for a $5 million company. And Rand was a young guy at the time, is still a young guy, but it was even younger then, and had sort of in his ear somebody telling him that a SaaS company, a software as a service company, should be trading at 4 times future revenue multiple. So he thought that while they were at 5 today, he thought they could get to 10. And so in his mind, he's multiplying 4 times 10 or $40 million for this little $5 million business. And so he says to Brian Halligan, it's 40 million or nothing. And Halligan says, well, it'll have to be nothing then. And then walked away. And they kind of parted ways. And instead of selling the business, Rand raised venture capital. And the way the VCs invested is they get preferred shares. They guarantee them a preferred return before the founder shares get anything. And that's an important part of the story, because as the business grew and the VCs wanted Rand to spend more and more of their money, they got into a bunch of different product lines they weren't really in the business of being in. They weren't very differentiated. The company started to bleed cash, so much so that they removed Rand as the CEO. And I interviewed him at this point. I said, well, at least you've got your Moz shares. They must be worth like a truckload, right? And he said, actually, John, I don't think they're worth anything. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, based on the way the VCs invested with preferred shares and the length of time they've held these shares, like I don't think I'm going to get any money out of Moz. And I said, but Rand, like, what would that offer of $25 million from HubSpot be worth today based on the appreciation of HubSpot stock? They're now a public company, et cetera. And he said it'd be worth close to $200 million. And I remember that story every time we're talking about this notion of sort of timing your exit. When's the right time to sell? Have I reached my freedom point? When you reach your freedom point, where the sale of your company would create enough liquid wealth, $25 million at the time would have been enough. It is enough and will have been enough for Rand to live for 3 generations, let alone 1. Yet he chose to turn it down. So it's just this, I think, important point that at the very least, we should all pull up and say is now the right time.
Yeah. And I think it's doing some of those self-critical analyses of saying, what are we doing well? What are we doing wrong? There's a concept that, what do you have control over? How can you see the future? You had control over the 25 million, but people kind of get interested in making more. At some point, I think a business owner has to be like, is it enough? Is it enough for me to live? And you can't say, well, if I sell it for 25 million, then it's enough, right? Or if I sell it for 40 million, then it's enough. The market is always going to bear the price, right? So in this case, the market said, no, the market isn't at 40 million for a $5 million company. And it's not, if the market isn't there for this company, right? Because of the specifics of this company. And I think that when people start to sell, they always think it's the price. And it's like, well, the price wasn't there. Instead, it's a lot of other things. It's the legacy of your company. It's, who is it culturally right? A lot of times when people go to sell their company, they're like, we got to get the price up to here. And then, you get it there. And then they're like, well, are you going to keep all my people?
Right.
Are you going to continue to do good service like I do? Are you going to continue to? And I was like, whoa. You don't get to tell them how they do any of that.
Yeah. They're buying your business.
You get to pick the price. Now, if you want to pick, and so then they go back and they look at the top 3 buyers and they're like, well, maybe we would go with these guys. Maybe they're not the highest price, but they're the best fit. Right. And so I think people don't understand when you go down this to sell the business, it is a huge emotional thing and it's a financial thing. But when it comes right down to it, sometimes that price isn't everything. It is the starting.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think there's 2 questions people need to answer is what's my business worth? And they can ask that question of you and you can give them a direct answer. The other question though is perhaps slightly more nuanced and maybe more interesting in some ways. And that is, what's your business worth to you? That's a different question. What's your business worth and what's your business worth to you? And for some people, let me put it this way. When your business is worth more to the market, in other words, Melissa says it's worth X and you think about your own number and you're like, wow, it's worth that. Well, it sure ain't worth that to me. That's a great time to sell, right? Mm-hmm. And equally, if it's worth more to you for psychological reasons, maybe for cash flow reasons, maybe for all kinds of other reasons, than it's worth in the market, it's not a good time to sell. You're going to be disappointed. I'm reminded of a guy I interviewed on Bill Radio, a guy named Sean Oshman, and he built a little IT services business based in Denver, Colorado, a couple million in revenue, not a big business, right? And Sean reached his 39th birthday, and he had a kind of an epiphany, and he said, you know what, 40 is a big milestone birthday. I want to really change things up. And he'd always had a vision board of a sailboat, and he always sort of had this kind of fantasy of living on a sailboat. And so he said to himself on his 39th birthday, by my 40th birthday, I want to live on a sailboat. And this is a guy who lives in Denver. Like, there isn't an ocean within 1,000 miles, right? And so that's his goal. So he hires a broker. Broker comes back and gets him an offer. I think it was about 2.6 times SDE, seller's discretionary earnings. So, like, a pretty average multiple for a kind of a small service business. And I interviewed Sean, and I said, but Sean, like 2.6 times, I mean, wasn't a huge multiple. You could have stayed 3 years and kind of put all that profit in your jeans. Like, how do you feel about the exit? And he's like, oh, I'm super happy. And I'm like, but it was only 2.6 times. And he's like, yeah, but I live on a sailboat. Mm-hmm. And it was always, it kind of hit me between the eyes when he said that, but it's always stuck with me as important as the conversation about valuation is. I mean, I own a company called Value Builder, so it's like, it's kind of a big deal for me. I have to always remember that the happiest entrepreneurs after they sell are ones who have something they're going to, right? Mm-hmm. And having pull factors, something you're excited to go do next, live on a sailboat, write a book, get fit, whatever, run a marathon. If you've got really clear goals, valuation becomes somewhat secondary, right? Mm-hmm. Because you've got somewhere to go. Whereas if you're just kind of eking out, every last dollar from your business, and you're going to go sit on a rocking chair and sip lemonade and talk about how the good old days were, it's a recipe for disaster. No matter how much you get for your company, I think you will sit back and regret it. You'll wonder, could I gotten more? Should I have treated my employees better? Like, you'll have all the money in the world, but none of the peace of mind that comes from being excited to go do something in the future. So, I think it would really help people to think about, what are my pull factors? What are the things I'm excited to go do? And if you can codify those, write them down, really get clear on them, you may find that your business is worth more to the market than it is to you right now, based on all the exciting things you want to go do. And I think that's a great time to sell.
And I've talked to clients just like you've said, and they're like, well, if I just stay in the business for 3 to 5 years, I would get the same amount of money. I said, okay, well, let's do that. Why don't you continue to run the business for 3 to 5 years? You'll make that money. And then whatever you sell at that point will be icing on the cake. And they're like, yeah, but it's so stressful. Yeah, but I'm so tired. Right. And I'm like, okay, well, let's figure out what is the difference that you're going to make by working that 3 to 5 years. And is it worth it? Because again, a business owner just needs the facts to make the decisions, so the facts, a $5 million deal to you could mean completely something different, $5 million deal to somebody else. And that's fine. You make those decisions based on it. But I think that an interesting thing that we're seeing a lot of during the pandemic, and, while we're still in the pandemic, is that I'm seeing a lot of business owners be approached by buyers. So buyers have the money right now. In some respect, it is a little bit of a buyer's market, but in the same respect, it's hard to say, like, it is really a seller's market, because a lot of these sellers, if they're making money and they're making more money than they did in the past, like, they're just trying to stay afloat, right? They don't have time to talk to buyers. They don't have time to even think about selling their company. Like, let's go get this. So what if a potential buyer comes to you and is like, hey, I'm kind of interested. Are you willing to sell? Like, how does somebody respond to that? And do they just say, yeah, sure, I'd like to sell for $40 million?
Okay. So look, there's a lot packed into that question. Let's kind of try to unpack it. I think, first of all, if you are proactively wanting to sell, if you're Sean Oshman and you decide that by your 40th birthday, you want to go do something else and you don't want to look desperate, you don't want to go hat in hand to a buyer saying, oh, would you buy my business? Would you be interested? I think the best way to approach that is to say, would you like to partner? I think partner is in some level code for, do you want to buy my business? But it at least gives you plausible deniability that that was not your intent. When Stephanie Breedlove, the woman I referenced earlier, who built the payroll company, approached care.com, she didn't approach them saying, would you like to buy us? Mm-hmm. She had a marketing partnership first and foremost, just a content sharing agreement at a very low level, a marketing manager level. And then she daisy chained her way from the marketing manager to the director to the CMO to the CEO about deepening their partnership together. And so if you want to get an acquisition conversation started without looking like you're desperate, I think it makes sense to focus on using the word partnership or even strategic partnership as a way to do that. Now, if you get approached, now this is the other side of the coin, you get approached, I think you've got to create some sort of marketplace for your company. Right now, owners are getting approached all the time by private equity groups and strategic acquirers. And if you start that conversation with that acquirer, you are walking down a slippery slope into a trap. And the trap is being suckered into a proprietary deal. A proprietary deal is when an acquirer buys your business without competition. It's like catnip for acquirers. I mean, this is the holy grail, right? If you're an acquirer, your private equity group, you're trying to get an owner to engage with you without competition, because competition obviously drives up the price. And when they get you hooked and interested enough, they're going to put a letter of intent in front of you, which is going to put a big number out there, and it's going to be more money than you've ever seen probably in your bank account. And it's going to come with what's the word?
Stop shop.
Hitch. What's that?
Stop shop.
Yeah, it's going to come with I was trying to think of a word. It's going to come with a no shop clause, and a no shop clause means that you agree not to negotiate with any other acquirers. And once you sign that, your negotiating leverage diminishes dramatically. In fact, the balance of power in the relationship goes from you having all the power as the seller with a profitable and desirable business to them. They will protract due diligence. They'll pick apart your business. They'll send a bunch of analysts to try to discover everything that's wrong with your business. And days before they close the deal, it's very common for them to retrade, which is to lower the price that they originally agreed to sell or buy you for in the letter of intent. And at that retrading stage, you're then stuck between a rock and a hard place. You've given up the ability to negotiate with anybody else. You've told your spouse, you've bought the ski house in your mind or the car or the, whatever, and you've lost all negotiating leverage in the process. And so they know that. The acquirers are sophisticated and they know they've got you over a barrel. And so most people agree to be rate traded on. They drop 10, 15, 20% off the value of their company. And it's just a common mistake that we make. It's like an unforced error. And it happens so innocently. It happens when an acquirer approaches you and say, wow, Melissa, you've built this great business. Can we grab lunch? I'd love to learn more about what you do. And I'd love to partner with you. And I'd love to see if we could buy you. And if you get too far into that conversation without creating competitive tension, you run the risk of being suckered into a proprietary deal.
Yeah, no, I think that is excellent information. Now, I think another area that is, from a buyer's perspective, is about talking about it. So we have several people that are in the process of selling their company, and it always comes down to, like, when should I tell my employees? Like, well, I'm thinking of selling, because a lot of times these businesses have had long-term employees, or even when an owner starts to do anything slightly different, people are going to know, if you even show up, if you drink a different coffee, people are going to know. So if you start doing something profound, like meetings where you're not telling anybody where you're going and things like that, then they're going to start wondering. So is there a best time to tell them, or should you just tell them at the beginning?
Yeah, look, this is a tricky one, because I agree with you. A lot of entrepreneurs feel like they need to tell their employees. They feel like they're morally obligated to tell their employees. A lot of entrepreneurs hire family members, treat employees as if they were family members. And so it becomes like you're a cheating spouse and you're kind of skulking around the office with this terrible secret and you're not telling anybody. And it can feel very duplicitous and just hypocritical and terrible and very uneasy for a lot of owners. And I think that is a problem. Here's the other side of the coin though. And that is that if you choose to tell your employees, there are two problems with that. Number one, what are your employees going to do? They're going to feel like their job is in jeopardy. No matter how many times you tell them it's not, they will. And what are they going to do? They're going to go brush up their LinkedIn resume, their LinkedIn profile, and they're going to shop that experience that you gave them to your competitors, right? If you've given them experience in an industry, they're going to go to the people in the industry, and your industry is going to find out you're for sale, and that diminishes your negotiating leverage with an acquirer. Number one. I think the other thing to keep in mind, and I know, Melissa, you've seen this in your own work, is that not all businesses that enter into a negotiation to sell actually close those transactions. A lot of people think it's less than half of all letters of intent finally get consummated. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I think it's a fairly significant proportion of deals that even go so far as to a letter of intent, never actually close. And so what have you done? You've created chaos among your employees. You've made them fear their job, all for what? For maybe nothing in the end. And so look, I'm not a big fan of telling your employees, even though it is a situation where what is morally correct is often strategically wrong. I think the best thing to do is divide your employees into two buckets. You've got most employees, your rank and file employees, who find out when the check clears your bank account, right? When the acquisition is closed. And then maybe you've got two or three key people, maybe a finance person, maybe a marketing person, a salesperson, who need to know, right? Because you're going to be going through management presentations. You're going to go through this whole process that people are going to find, your senior people might find out. In those cases, you want to make sure they've got an NDA and give some skin in the game. Make sure that they've got some incentive to help you close the sale. It could be options. It could be just a stay bonus. It could be a success bonus that you pay contingent on you successfully selling your business. But those, I think, are just a couple, two or three people that you let under the covers. For most people, I think they find out after the fact.
Well, and even those couple people should probably have employment contracts with the company. So these are some of the things that you can do a couple of years before you go to sell. Get employee agreements, do various things that get you more saleable. But the other thing is, I think that when, we work together with our employees and things like that, and you're very transparent with information. But the reality is you're also burdening them with the information. So you think you're being truthful to your employees and you're providing them information, but you're really confusing them, because if you change your mind, then they're like, oh, what? Okay, now we're not selling. Are we selling? I planned on not selling. Now we're selling. Now we're not selling. You're actually creating more chaos in their world, and you're providing this burden, because you're not only telling them, hey, we might sell, but you got to keep it quiet. Don't tell anybody. Oh, can you tell your spouse? Well, not really. Well, you're going to anyway. Well, these things kind of get out. And if it doesn't happen, the thing is, if it doesn't happen, you have that out there that you tried to sell and you failed. And the failure is going to fall on you. That the failure was because you, whatever reason, but it's by default going to go to the seller, not the buyer, because the buyer's like, well, they're smart. They're a big company. They're a, Fortune 500, whatever. It was probably you. You're probably not that good. You don't have enough money. So I think that there is a tendency to tell clients and employees, earlier, and I try to get them to be told like 48 hours or less before the transaction happens, so that it's really kind of already a done deal. Everything's going to happen. And you said something important too, is that this transaction is not done until everybody has signed. So I have a lot of clients that are like, we got a deal. And I was like, we don't have a deal. Okay, this is a process. You're going to need to go through the process. And when you cross, you are on mile 13 of a marathon, right? So do you complete the marathon if you get to mile 15, 16, 22, 20? No, you don't. So I need you to focus on the finish line, the actual crossing over of that, because it's going to get harder when we get closer to that finish line. There's going to be things that we're going to really, the nitpicky things. So I think, and then the motion kicks in, right? They're like, oh, wait, what am I going to do tomorrow? I'm going to give away my, and a lot of times that's a misnomer too, because a lot of times there's a transition period of 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, so I say, trust me, you'll get sick of them before they get sick of you. It'll be okay, but I think it's just educating people on the process, and that, you cannot make the deal go any faster than it is. And it is only done when everybody has signed it. And quite frankly, even then, the money literally hits your bank account. Like, then I feel you should celebrate. Because until then, there's a lot of other things that can go wrong, and such. So I don't know if there's another question or something. I think we've gone quite a long time giving a lot of information. I wanted to give a little bit of information about you. The only other question that I think is kind of interesting that we could maybe end on is, how can, the reality is, I can come in, you can come in, and we can value this business, right? And then we can say this business is worth $2 million. But when we go to market, like I said before, the market creates the price. So how do we get more than the $2 million?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. It's creating a bidding war. It's ensuring that you create a market for your company. And a market obviously has multiple people that are aware of it, that the information is transparent and can make a reasonable conclusion about what your business is worth. And when you create that marketplace, you can be sure that you got a fair price because you let multiple people look at it. And B, you can oftentimes get the value of your business increased just because more bidders, more value generally. I'm reminded of a guy I interviewed on bestselling named Arik Levy, who built 2 businesses in the locker space. If you go to Whole Foods, there'll be like Amazon lockers. Mm-hmm. That sort of business model. In his case, he did it first in dry cleaning. And in his first business, he kind of didn't know what he was doing, and he decided to sell. He got an offer from one person and kind of didn't create a marketplace and said, okay, sure, I'll sell to you. They went through due diligence, and that acquirer retraded, as I was describing earlier. They lowered their price, and Arik kind of his nose was out of joint. He was like, well, maybe I won't sell. But then he'd already gone on to, figure out other things he wanted to go do. And so he decided to sell. Closing day comes, and that acquirer has not got the money to make the acquisition and says that you're going to have to finance us to buy this business. So basically, Arik agreed to take his money over time and risk over time that they would pay him back. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds, right? Retrading, seller financing, disaster in both ways. So Arik builds another business, and it's also in the locker space. This time he's installing these lockers in these sort of high-end Manhattan apartment buildings. And the second time, Arik says, you know what, I'm going to create a marketplace. I'm not going to just fall in love with the first guy or gal who kind of comes and knocking. He hires an M&A professional, a guy named Trip Wolf based in New York. And Trip creates the marketplace, right? He goes and shops the deal. He creates a teaser, and then he creates a sim, and he shops it to lots of different potential buyers. Starts with hundreds, ultimately gets down to a short list of 5 buyers who put in an offer, a letter of intent. And before Arik signs one of the letters, interestingly, the 5 were plus or minus 10% of one another. The introduction offers, in other words, the beginning offers, were plus or minus 10%. But instead of just signing one and giving up his negotiating real leverage, Trip's like, leave it with me, Arik. I'm going to see if we can squeeze these guys a little bit. And he played one off the other, off the other, off the other, off the other, and ultimately got the price of the business up by 300%. In other words, 3 times more than those original offers were coalescing around. It's a story that has always left me with chills, because I realized that this is where business owners leave tremendous amounts of money on the table. If they don't create a marketplace for their business, they can leave literally millions of dollars on the table, and they will never know. And we talked about, the guy rocking in the rocking chair lemonade, regretting his decision to sell. One of the reasons they regret is they wonder all of a sudden out of the blue, oh my gosh, did I leave money on the table? I took the first offer I got. I was approached. I never created a marketplace. Creating a marketplace, you may not get acquirers to increase the value that they're willing to pay, but you will win nonetheless, because you will get the peace of mind to know that you did get a fair price for your business, and that is priceless. Mm-hmm. So I think creating this marketplace is it's a really important part of selling a company.
Well, and it's like anything. If you're walking down the street and you see, a random, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to do a great analogy, but like you're walking down the street, you see the kind of a cute car, and you're like, okay, I need a car to drive. Like I'm walking, obviously. Okay, how much is that car? Well, $5,000. I'm like, okay, I can afford that. Da da da. And then you walk down the street and you're like, okay, maybe I'll buy that car. And it's like, oh, that's $100,000. Why the hell is this 100,000? Mm-hmm. Oh, because, and then you look and there's a line down the street of all the people that want to buy that particular car. And you're like, well, wait, maybe I want the car. Well, no, but you have that $5,000. Well, I don't, but maybe this car's better. It is all of the same psychology that goes into anything that we purchase, that we see mass approval of it. And you're like, well, and then sometimes it's even preventing the other person from getting it, right? Like, oh, my buddy Joe's also, no, Joe can't get this. I'm going to get it. How much now? And that is the ideal. But I will also tell you, on the other side of the spectrum, I've seen private company deals with another private company. The culture fit was amazing. The person would actually pick the company that had the best cultural fit, that they knew would fall in line with what they were doing. And it was like $1 million less. And it was $1 million that they were willing to give up because that was more important to them. So again, I think it is the knowledge that you have of what other people would pay for it, what you determine is most important to you. And a lot of times I'm forcing and telling the owners to trust their gut instinct, like, because they'll be like, oh, that's the best deal. But like, I just don't feel good with that company. I don't feel good with that. They've already had red flags. They've already renegotiated. They've already done all of this. And I'm like, well, we have to lean into that. And a lot of times it is about finding the owners enough. If they have enough, then they are okay with the deal. And then it has all these other boxes that it checks. And so as much as I think that the traditional auction style process is amazing, I also think that business owners are smart enough and confident enough to know if it's the right deal. Because I have a lot of business owners that have enough wealth to last them for a long time, right?
Generations, yeah.
For forever. And then it comes down to, what do you want the story to be about this company? What do you want the story to be with that buyer? Is that the story you want to tell? Because I also tell them, you can't control what the buyer does. I've had buyers that have told clients that they would do A, B, and C, and they on day one shut everything down, fire everybody, and take the clients. I've seen that, so you can't control that. You can only do what you think is best for whatever your situation is. And a lot of times that requires planning. It doesn't require somebody miraculously showing up at your door and offering you $5 million to buy your company, right? These things are happening, but it also is that you have to proactively seek to do that, to at least get your company to the point of being that golden egg, right? Because no matter what, whether you sell or don't sell, if you create the golden egg, it's then probably giving you money, right? And profitability and a lifestyle. And it would eventually then also could be sold for your estate and other types of things. So any last parting kind of thoughts on what people should do? And then I want you to tell us a little bit more about the value builder system.
Yeah, no, I think you've encapsulated it really well. I think creating a business that can thrive without you is a sellable asset, gives you the ultimate poker hand in the game of life. I mean, you could sell it for the highest bidder and walk away. You could bring in an investor and sell half of it or a third of it or a quarter. You could bring in a manager to run it and just treat it as an asset. You could bring in a chief operating officer and just do the strategic stuff, the stuff that you like, and let all the other stuff go to the COO. All of this is possible if you create it so that it can thrive without you. And so I think that's the kind of culminating idea that hopefully people take away from this show.
And working in the system that we're going to talk about right now is sometimes it does require working with other professionals and business advisors to figure out how to do that recurring revenue, right? Because a lot of us are in the find the customer, charge the customer, leave the customer, find the customer, charge the customer, leave the customer. But there's a lot of times where there could be residual, like for the valuation world. I have a lot of companies that just do valuations every year. And it's the metric that they use. Obviously, those are lower priced, products, but they're committed, and I'm committed to doing this. Either it's transitioning over time to key employees or family members, but it's a plan and it's a process. And that's where, this is not a sales tactic. This is a lot of these things that you want to put into place take time, and they can't just be put into place in what you can't create an operating system verbally in a book about everything that happens in your company overnight. It is a process, so it's working in that process so that you are ready when those opportunities happen. And I think that, everybody, as you're watching some of this podcast, you might be like, John is really, he's got a fancy mic. He's got a nice background. Well, one thing that you may not know about John is that he is actually the host of Built to Sell Radio, which is a podcast, and it's ranked by Forbes as one of the world's 10 best podcasts for business owners. So I encourage you to also take a look at that. I think we have a couple things. You can reach out to John directly, but a couple other things. So in 2015, he first wrote Built to Sell. So create a business that can thrive without you, that we talked about. But then he wrote another best-selling book, which is The Automatic Customer, and how do you create a subscription business in any industry, which I think is very key. Subscription-based businesses actually get bought based on revenue and multiples of revenue. So this is a good kind of process. He also created another book, which was The Art of Selling Your Business, Winning Strategies and Secret Hacks for Exiting at the Top. And so the thing that I want to talk a little bit about now, though, is the value builder system, because this is a system that a company could come to you and utilize, for their own business. But really, it's for advisors to start to help business owners create what, right? What are people going to come and develop in this value builders? Like, what does this do, John? Come on, let us know.
Our mission is to level the playing field for business owners as they approach their exit. Like, that's what we do, right? And to have a big impact on the world, we know we need partners. We need people who share our mindset, share our sort of philosophy of being in the owner's corner. And so we license our software and the corresponding content to professional advisors. So accounting firms, M&A firms, business coaching firms, consulting firms, and they use it as a way to talk to their clients, the business owners they work with, about value. And some of them choose to coach the owner on how to improve their value, and we've got a tool for that. Others just use it as a conversation starter to try to get the owner to really understand what drives value in a company, and some of the things we talked about, like their psychological readiness to exit. And so it's a practice management software that we license to advisory firms, typically boutique advisory firms. We've got firms all around the world, about 1,000 of them around the world that are partners and give us reach around the world. So if a business owner is listening to this and wants help, we can connect them to an advisor. Just go to valuebuilder.com and we'll get you set up with a certified value builder.
Well, and the other thing that I think would be a little, maybe of interest is that when we first started the podcast, you talked about like, how do you look at these drivers, compare it to your company, and then how do you move up and get more price when you go to sell? And so, and these are the metrics, because again, this isn't an arbitrary, these are the 8 builders and, rate this from 1 to 5. This is, a culmination of what people in the industry have seen results in higher earnings, because, a higher price, because intellectually and logically it makes sense. The less reliance you have on the business owner, you should get more money for that company. And so you just have a process that says, okay, let's look at all of these things and see how you rank compared to other people. That's and right. What they've sold for. So that's a little bit more to me for the business owner and even the advisor. That is getting deeper into this story that, quite frankly, a lot of times the deals that I've seen crater is because they didn't get very deep in the story. And some little tiny little frog, nasty little skeleton snuck out, and part of the story emerged, and everybody was like, whoa, that's a bad part of the story. Why didn't we know about that? And it craters a deal. So I think that getting into the depths of the story, a lot of times business owners don't know what could crater a deal. And we need to get deeper so that we can help you get to that point. And this kind of tool helps us.
Exactly right.
Okay. So if you have any additional questions, I would encourage you to reach out directly to John, because he is the specialist and the expert in this area. And I completely appreciate, I think at some point in the future, John, if we have questions about certain industries, maybe we could take one industry and kind of walk through some of the drivers in that industry and kind of give them a good look at how this works. So maybe that would be a good future podcast.
Part 2. That'd be fun.
All right. Well, thanks, John. We appreciate all your time.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun to be with you.